There are theories that the novel illustrates the 7 deadly sins, which are pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. And these theories tend to try to ascribe these characteristics to the minor characters within the novel. That these qualities are present in the novel is undoubtedly the case, and that these qualities perhaps would chiefly form the unpleasant, not to say sinister, aspects and qualities of the ways in which some people behave towards others, would also be the case. I think it must be deliberate that these qualities are all to be found in this novel. Some of them we see pronouncedly in other novels. So, for example, pride is something that we see pronouncedly in quite a number of Jane Austen's novels. Greed also we see in the covetousness of John and Fanny Dashwood as they inherit the estate and all the things that especially his wife wishes to preserve, and her envy over the tea service going off with the original Mrs. Dashwood, Eleanor, Marianne and Margaret. We see other examples of envy, especially in Emma. A certain amount of jealousy and envy between Emma and Jane Fairfax, between Emma and Mrs. Elton. Pride is all over the place. We see a fair bit of pride in Pride and Prejudice, for one thing. Greed as well. Greed, I think I already talked about greed, actually. Well, yes, greed, pride. Gluttony, I think we see less of in other novels. Food is talked about a lot in Emma, but not in a gluttonous way, I don't think. Almost the reverse. There's such an emphasis on gruel in Emma. Lust, we see lust in Pride and Prejudice for sure. We see lust in Sense and Sensibility, again, as well. Willoughby is obviously quite lustful. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice is obviously quite lustful. I think Mr. Elliot in Persuasion is quite lustful. But we see less of this in Emma, less of it in Northanger Abbey. But of course it's present here in Mansfield Park in the character of the Admiral, and also in Henry Crawford. Gluttony, of course, the Reverend Grant. Sloth, Lady Bertram. Sloth, do we see that predominantly anywhere else? Mrs. Bennet, perhaps, in Pride and Prejudice, although she's a more neurotic than slothful. Mary Musgrove, possibly. She's a bit of a valetudinarian, perhaps more than slothful. Wrath. Sir Walter Elliot strikes me as being someone full of suppressed wrath, but that severe resentment which is expressed in an undercurrent by Mrs. Norris throughout this novel is unparalleled in any of Jane Austen's other novels. And this wrath is not to be quenched, not to be appeased, and it is abusive. It does count as abuse, and it would be classified the way in which Mrs. Norris speaks to Fanny Price would be classified as psychological abuse of a child, according to today's standards. And this is very clearly observed by Jane Austen. It's censured by Jane Austen at a time and at a period when speaking harshly to children and castigating children and punishing them very severely was the norm. So in realising that this kind of treatment could be very detrimental to a young developing psychology, Jane Austen is showing herself to be really well in advance of the vanguard. I'm not sure the extent to which even the whole concept of psychology was highly developed at this period. So whilst it can be seen that certain of these sins would be exemplified by different characters, they're not the only quality that character would possess, and these deadly sins are not possessed only by that one character in the course of the novel. So some of them may be possessed by only one character, but others will be shared across characters. So yes, I think as part of the religious theme within the novel they're present, but that they move towards sort of caricature within the characters, I don't think so. Another way in which religion features in this novel is the concept of sin. We're not dealing with sins such as murder or theft, not downright theft. Political level, we may consider that Mansfield Park being built on wealth derived from estates, sugar plantations, where work was carried out by slaves. We may regard this as theft, but within the society, politically nowadays, within the society that the novel is set, this would not have been perceived as theft by the generality of people. Some would have seen it as such, definitely. The type of sins that we're dealing with in Mansfield Park are much more the sins of transgression, sins connected with personal conduct. They're not crimes against humanity per se, apart from what I've just discussed, although that's outside of the actual arena of Mansfield Park in the novel. This tends to make the novel feel quite heavy, especially to the modern reader. The modern reader will probably feel a dislike towards so many aspects of personal conduct being regarded as sinful, because morals have changed, morals have adapted, and we allow people much greater range of activity within their personal code of morals nowadays than was really allowed people at this time in order to remain within the bounds of socially acceptable behaviour. So the novel has a judgmental feel to it. It has a sense of infringement upon the individual for the modern reader, which doesn't tend to be attractive. The kind of morality that around personal conduct that we have today is what we feel as a society is attractive to us. It's engaging to us. We prefer it, in other words. Otherwise we wouldn't live that way. We would go back to the way of living in Jane Austen's times, perhaps. But we don't. And so therefore this novel, perhaps more so than any other of Jane Austen's novels, is set on a plane, on a level, that makes entree into engaging with the characters, engaging with their environment, a little bit of a hurdle to overcome for the modern reader. There is considerably less endorsement in this novel of a woman's natural instincts, There's pretty much no endorsement of a woman's sexuality, I think, probably. Unlike, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, where the novel pretty much is alive with the tension of romantic attraction between Jane and Bingley, between Elizabeth and Darcy, and Lydia obviously is exploding with teenage female hormones, and as a result runs off with Wickham at one stage, much to the dreadful consternation of her family. Not though so much because her family has a deep moral prejudice against what's happened. Her elder sisters feel it to be a shame and something that Lydia really ought to have known so much better than. Their father takes it very seriously and is very grey and bowed down by the whole situation. Mrs. Bennet and the other youngest daughter, Kitty, they don't see it as a shame at all. Once Lydia gets married, that's absolutely fine, everything's okay, and Lydia does go on to be perfectly socially acceptable despite this. But when something similar happens in Mansfield Park, it's regarded much more seriously, it's judged much more harshly. Although it is important to remember that when Maria runs off with Henry Crawford, she's breaking the sacrament of marriage, so it's a lot more serious sin than just being a little bit too prone to expressing animal spirits. I think in order to be able to read Mansfield Park and to enjoy it, or even simply to accept it, one needs to be prepared to accept many of the social premises that the novel sets out, many of the ideas about personal conduct, social morality that the novel sets out. And I think it's probably useful to establish what these are, to understand what they are, to read around a little bit in social history to understand them. And then, during the course of reading the novel, it's more possible to assess how the author is handling the society that she lives in. This was a period of change. It was a period of displacement. People were moving around. The social order was being broken up both by war, the Napoleonic Wars, and by the agricultural revolution and industrialization. Society was beginning to become more urbanized. And as a result, society was changing. The values of society were changing. And we live in a world today as well where the values of society are changing. Where people live is changing. People are not staying in the country that they were born in. They're traveling all around the world for whatever reason it is that they perceive that they're doing that, either for work or because they're fleeing oppression or because they think they can have a better lifestyle where if they live somewhere else they can provide better for their families, whatever. So this is also happening today. And as different cultures move around the world, as the internet encourages different forms of communication between people and forms of communication which aren't actually based in real contact, again, our morality and how we perceive personal conduct and the rules of engagement within personal conduct are all changing. And if we look back at how this was happening in a parallel period 2 centuries ago, to people whose words and language and feelings we can relate to, even if we don't relate always to their values, it will be useful to our understanding. Jane Austen is a genius and a brilliant writer, a great perceiver of human nature. And we may also gain insight by looking at the world she depicts, even if it doesn't seem sympathetic to us, because there are elements of our own world which will not be sympathetic to us. How does she handle that? How does she look at social progress, Does she concede it, or does she not? And what do we think about that position? Either way.